August 12, 1944. The sun blazed mercilessly over the rolling hills of southern France, where Private First Class Daniel Harrington of the 157th Infantry Regiment crouched in the shadow of an ancient olive tree. The American forces had been pushing inland from the Mediterranean for nearly 48 hours since the landings, and the heat had become as formidable an enemy as the German forces themselves. Daniel believed, as did most of his comrades, that their advance would continue largely unimpeded as they drove toward their objective of securing the vital crossroads at Saint-Maximin. How terribly wrong they would all be proven in the coming hours. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable account of how two men, positioned on opposite sides of a devastating global conflict, would discover that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality and allegiance, and how a simple act of kindness would ripple outward to create an extraordinary debt that would be repaid in the most unexpected way. The 157th Infantry Regiment had been tasked with securing a series of small villages dotting the French countryside as part of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. Intelligence reports suggested minimal resistance in this sector, as German forces had been heavily depleted through redeployments to Normandy following the D-Day landings in June. The Americans had made good progress, advancing nearly 15 miles inland within the first day of operations. Lieutenant Colonel James Weatherford, the battalion commander, had gathered his company commanders that morning for a briefing at their temporary headquarters, established in an abandoned farmhouse. "Gentlemen, German resistance has been lighter than anticipated. Latest intelligence indicates the village of Montagne-sur-Colline should be lightly defended, possibly by elements of the 338th Infantry Division. Though most of their combat-effective units have been transferred north, we expect no more than a company-sized element, possibly just a rear guard. Baker Company will lead the advance." Questions? Captain Thomas Aldridge, commanding Baker Company, studied the maps spread across the weathered oak table. "Rules of engagement for civilians and prisoners, sir?" "Standard procedures, Captain. We expect some collaborators may be in the area. Treat all civilians with caution but respect. Prisoners are to be processed according to protocols and moved to collection points for transfer to the rear areas. Water discipline remains critical. Temperatures are forecast to hit 95 degrees today. Make sure your men conserve supplies. We don't expect resupply trucks until tomorrow morning." Private Harrington had joined the regiment as a replacement only 3 weeks earlier, following the losses incurred during the Italian campaign. At 20 years old, he had grown up on his family's small farm in Nebraska, where life had instilled in him a solid work ethic and a straightforward moral compass. His company commander, Captain Aldridge, had quickly recognized Daniel's reliability and assigned him as a runner, responsible for delivering messages between platoons when radio communications were compromised or impractical. As Baker Company moved out toward their objective, Technical Sergeant Frank Morelli, a veteran who had fought from Sicily through Anzio, fell into step alongside Daniel. "First time in real action, Harrington?" Morelli asked, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of Brooklyn. "Yes, Sergeant. Got my baptism of fire in some skirmishes last week, but nothing major." Morelli nodded, adjusting the strap of his Browning automatic rifle. "Listen up. The heat's going to be worse than the Germans today. I've seen guys drop from heat stroke faster than from enemy fire. Whatever happens, save some water. Not just for yourself, but sometimes for others. That canteen can be more valuable than ammunition in these conditions." Daniel appreciated the advice. His own canteen was 3/4 full, and he had been carefully rationing his water since the previous evening. The regiment's supply trucks were behind schedule, delayed by congested roads as the Allied advance continued to push inland. By midday, Baker Company had reached a ridge overlooking their objective, the village of Montagne-sur-Colline. The settlement consisted of perhaps 30 stone buildings clustered around a small church whose bell tower dominated the landscape. Fields of lavender and grapevines surrounded the village, their vibrant colors contrasting sharply with the tension of the moment. Captain Aldridge deployed his platoons in preparation for the advance. First platoon would enter from the west, second platoon from the south, while third platoon would provide support by fire from elevated positions on the ridge. The Americans had the advantage of numbers, with approximately 120 men against what intelligence suggested was no more than 30 to 40 German defenders. As Daniel waited with the company headquarters element, he observed a local Frenchman approaching under a white flag. Captain Aldridge, accompanied by a translator, Corporal Meyer, went forward to meet him. The Frenchman, who introduced himself as Marcel Dupont, revealed that he was part of the local resistance. "The Germans are leaving," he explained through the translator. "Perhaps 20 soldiers remain in the village. Their officer is a young lieutenant named Weber. He has been fair to the townspeople, prevented looting by his men. They are preparing defensive positions at the northern edge of town, but they are short of ammunition and water." Captain Aldridge considered this information carefully. "Can you tell me about their defenses? Any artillery or heavy weapons?" "One machine gun position at the church tower, another near the old stone bridge. A few riflemen in the buildings along the main road. No artillery that we have seen. Their vehicles left yesterday, 3 trucks and a staff car." This intelligence prompted Captain Aldridge to modify his approach. He ordered 1st Platoon to swing wider to the west to flank the machine gun position at the church, while 2nd Platoon would advance more cautiously from the south. At 14:30 hours, the attack commenced. Daniel remained with the company headquarters, ready to run messages if the radio operators lost contact with the forward platoons. The initial advance met minimal resistance, with only scattered rifle fire greeting 1st Platoon as they approached the western edge of the village. 2nd Platoon, however, encountered more determined opposition. The German machine gun positioned near the stone bridge opened fire, pinning down the Americans and forcing them to seek cover among the grapevines and irrigation ditches outside the village. "Runner!" Captain Aldridge called, and Daniel hurried over. "Get to Lieutenant Parker with 2nd Platoon. Tell him to hold position while 1st Platoon clears the church tower. Once that gun is neutralized, 3rd Platoon will provide covering fire for his advance." Daniel sprinted in a crouched run, using the terrain for cover as he made his way toward 2nd Platoon's position. Occasional rounds snapped overhead, but the German fire was sporadic and undisciplined, the hallmark of troops low on ammunition and fighting a delaying action. He found Lieutenant Parker behind a low stone wall, binoculars raised as he assessed the German positions. "Captain says to hold here until 1st Platoon takes out the church position, sir," Daniel reported, breathing heavily from his sprint. Lieutenant Parker nodded without lowering his binoculars. "Acknowledged. We've identified their 2nd machine gun position. It's covering the main approach to the bridge. Tell the captain we've spotted movement suggesting they might be preparing to withdraw from the village altogether." As Daniel turned to head back to the company command post, the distinctive sound of the German MG-42 machine gun from the church tower suddenly fell silent, followed by scattered small arms fire. 1st Platoon had succeeded in neutralizing the position. The company radio crackled to life as Daniel returned to Captain Aldridge. "Eagle 6, this is Eagle 1-6. Church secured. 4 enemy personnel captured. No casualties on our side. Over." "Eagle 1-6, this is 6. Good work. Maintain position and prepare to support Eagle 2-6's advance. Over." With the elimination of the church tower position, the remaining German defenders began to withdraw from their positions near the bridge. 2nd Platoon advanced cautiously into the village, securing buildings as they went. By 1600 hours, the Americans had control of approximately half the village, with the German defenders retreating toward the northern outskirts. It was during this final phase of the operation that Daniel, who had been sent with a message to 3rd Platoon on the ridge, encountered the first German prisoner being escorted to the rear. The captured soldier was young, perhaps no more than 18, with dust-caked blonde hair and an exhausted expression that transcended language barriers. His uniform was the standard field grey of the Wehrmacht, though it hung loosely on his frame, suggesting weeks of inadequate rations. A corporal from 1st Platoon was escorting him, rifle at the ready but not displaying any particular hostility. The German soldier stumbled slightly as they passed Daniel on the narrow path. The corporal steadied him roughly by the arm. "Easy there, Fritz," the corporal said. "Still got a long walk to the collection point." Daniel noticed the German soldier's cracked lips and the way he swallowed repeatedly, clear signs of dehydration in the punishing heat. Without conscious deliberation, Daniel unhooked his canteen. "Hold up," he called to the corporal. "Give him some water." The corporal looked at Daniel with mild surprise. "Wasting water on a prisoner? Supply trucks aren't due until tomorrow." "I've got enough," Daniel insisted, extending the canteen toward the German soldier. The young German looked at Daniel with an expression of confusion that slowly transformed into cautious gratitude. He took the canteen with trembling hands. "Danke," he said softly, before taking several measured sips. The discipline with which he drank, not gulping despite his obvious thirst, suggested military training and self-control beyond his years. The German handed the canteen back to Daniel, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "My name is Friedrich Weber," he said, then switched to heavily accented English. "Thank you. Very kind." Daniel was surprised to hear his own language from the prisoner. "You speak English?" "A little. I study before war. At school." The corporal grew impatient. "All right, enough chit-chat. We need to get him back to the collection point." As they prepared to continue, Friedrich glanced back at Daniel. "Your name?" Daniel Harrington." Friedrich nodded, committing the name to memory. "Daniel Harrington," he repeated carefully. "I not forget." With that brief exchange concluded, the corporal led his prisoner away, and Daniel continued on his assigned task of delivering Captain Aldridge's message to 3rd Platoon. The encounter might have been forgotten entirely amid the chaos of the day's operations had subsequent events not elevated it to extraordinary significance. By 1700 hours, Baker Company had secured the entire village. The final count revealed that they had captured 11 German soldiers, while the remainder had successfully withdrawn to the north. American casualties were remarkably light. 2 wounded, none killed, testament to both the effectiveness of their tactics and the depleted state of the German defenders. Captain Aldridge established the company command post in the village's small hotel, a 2-story stone building with a red-tiled roof and a view of the central square. The captured Germans were processed and transferred to a regimental collection point, where they would await transport to prisoner-of-war facilities further behind the lines. That evening, as the soldiers of Baker Company settled into defensive positions around the village, intelligence reports arrived suggesting that elements of a German mechanized unit had been spotted approximately 10 miles to the northeast. The unit was identified as part of the 11th Panzer Division, a formation that intelligence had previously placed much further north. Their unexpected presence in the sector raised concerns about a possible counterattack. Lieutenant Colonel Weatherford arrived at the company command post shortly after 1900 hours to discuss the situation with Captain Aldridge. "Latest reports confirm it's elements of the 11th Panzer," Weatherford explained, pointing to positions on the map. "Appears to be a battle group built around a company of Panthers, supported by mechanized infantry. They may not even know we're here yet. They could be moving to reinforce positions further west." "Recommendation, sir?" Captain Aldridge asked. "Hold your current positions. I'm deploying Charlie Company to your northeast as a screen. If the German armor turns this way, we'll have some warning. I've also requested air support for tomorrow morning, but that depends on weather conditions. Artillery is being positioned to provide support if needed." As these strategic discussions continued, Daniel found himself assigned to a listening post on the northern edge of the village, alongside Staff Sergeant Miller and 2 other privates. Their position was in the cellar of an abandoned farmhouse, with observation slots providing views of the approaching roads and surrounding countryside. The night was uncomfortably warm, the air still and heavy with the scent of lavender from the nearby fields. Occasional distant sounds of vehicles could be heard from the northeast, the German mechanized units on the move. The Americans maintained radio silence, communicating only by runners when absolutely necessary. At approximately 1 in the morning, Staff Sergeant Miller nudged Daniel. "Your watch. I need to check on the other observation post, back in 20 minutes. Daniel took up position at one of the observation slots, straining his eyes to detect any movement in the moonlit landscape beyond. The other 2 soldiers in the cellar were catching brief moments of sleep, as per their rotation schedule. He had been on watch for perhaps 10 minutes when he heard a faint noise from the stairs leading down to their position. His first thought was that Sergeant Miller was returning earlier than expected, but instinct caused him to raise his rifle and aim it toward the stairwell. "Flash," he whispered, using the first half of that night's challenge and password combination. There was no immediate response, no thunder coming back to identify a friendly presence. Daniel's finger tensed on the trigger as a figure slowly emerged from the shadows of the stairwell. In the dim light, he could make out the distinctive shape of a German helmet. "Halt," he commanded in a hushed but forceful tone, conscious of his sleeping comrades nearby. The figure stopped, then spoke in a hushed voice with a German accent. "Daniel Harrington?" The unexpected sound of his own name froze Daniel momentarily. Recognition dawned as the figure removed his helmet, revealing the face of the young German soldier to whom Daniel had offered water earlier that day, Friedrich Weber. "How did you get here?" Daniel whispered, his rifle still trained on the German. "You were captured." "Escaped from collection point," Friedrich replied in his halting English. "Must speak with you. Very important." Daniel was torn between alerting his comrades and hearing what the German had to say. Curiosity, and perhaps the unusual nature of being addressed by name by an escaped prisoner, led him to maintain his silence, though he kept his rifle aimed steadily. "Speak quietly," he instructed. "Why are you here?" Friedrich made a subtle gesture indicating he meant no harm. "Your company is in danger. The 11th Panzer. They come here. Not just company. Full battle group. 3 companies of tanks. Mechanized infantry battalion. Orders to secure this crossroads before dawn." Daniel's skepticism was evident. "Why would you tell me this? Why escape just to warn us?" Friedrich's expression was solemn in the dim light. "You showed kindness, water. Most would not. I have family, mother, sister in Dresden. Not all Germans want this war. Some of us just soldiers like you, forced to fight." The sincerity in the German's voice was compelling, but Daniel remained cautious. "How do I know this isn't some trick? You could be trying to create panic, make us withdraw." "No trick," Friedrich insisted. "I was messenger for battalion staff. Saw the orders myself. Attack planned for 0400 hours. Full strength. At least 30 tanks, more infantry. Your position here," he gestured to encompass the village, "will be surrounded. No chance without preparation." Daniel weighed his options. If the German was telling the truth, Baker Company and potentially the entire battalion were in grave danger. If it was a deception, raising a false alarm could create unnecessary confusion. Yet something in Friedrich's manner, the risk he had taken in escaping and seeking out Daniel specifically, suggested he was being truthful. "Wait here," Daniel finally said. "Don't move." He backed toward one of his sleeping comrades and shook him awake, whispering quickly, "Cover him, don't shoot unless he makes a move. I need to get the sergeant." Without waiting for acknowledgement, Daniel slipped out of the cellar through a rear exit, moving quickly through the darkness toward the position, where he knew Staff Sergeant Miller would be checking the other observation post. He found Miller just as the sergeant was preparing to return to their position. "Sergeant," Daniel whispered urgently, "there's a German in our post. The prisoner I gave water to earlier. He escaped to warn us about a major attack coming at 0400 hours. Miller's expression hardened. "A German just walked into our post, and you left him there?" "Jenkins is covering him, sir. The German asked for me specifically by name. Says he was a messenger for their battalion staff and saw the orders himself. Claims it's not just a company from the 11th Panzer, but a full battle group, 3 tank companies, and a mechanized infantry battalion." Staff Sergeant Miller considered this information gravely. "That's a hell of a lot more than intelligence indicated. Could be a trick, could be genuine. Either way, we need to get him to Captain Aldridge immediately." They returned to the observation post, where they found the German sitting calmly on the floor, his empty hands visible, while Private Jenkins kept him covered. "On your feet," Miller ordered Friedrich. "We're taking you to the company command post." Friedrich nodded, rising slowly. "I come willingly. Must speak to your officers quickly. Not much time." The small group moved cautiously through the darkened village toward the hotel, serving as Baker Company's command post. Twice they had to identify themselves to American sentries, explaining the unusual nature of their German companion. At the command post, They found Captain Aldridge reviewing maps with his executive officer. Both looked up in surprise as Staff Sergeant Miller entered with a German soldier and 2 American privates. "What's the meaning of this, Sergeant?" Captain Aldridge demanded. "Sir, this German prisoner escaped from the collection point specifically to warn us. Private Harrington had an earlier interaction with him during the fighting. The prisoner claims there's a major attack coming at 0400 hours, significantly larger than what intelligence has reported." Captain Aldridge turned his attention to Friedrich. "You speak English?" "Yes, sir, some English," Friedrich responded, standing at attention despite being a prisoner. "Identify yourself." Gefreiter Friedrich Weber, 3rd Battalion, 338 Infantry Division, was acting as messenger for battalion staff. "And why should I believe anything you have to tell me?" Aldridge's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. Friedrich glanced briefly at Daniel before answering. "Your soldier showed kindness when others would not. I have no love for this war. My information is accurate. The 11th Panzer Division has assembled a battle group, 3 companies of Panthers and 1 battalion of mechanized infantry, approximately 40 tanks and 60 half-tracks total. They will attack along 3 axes toward this village at 0400 hours. Their objective is to secure the crossroads before Allied reinforcements can arrive from the south." Captain Aldridge exchanged glances with his executive officer. "That's considerably more force than battalion intelligence indicated." "I saw the orders myself," Friedrich insisted. "Was to deliver them between company commanders before I was captured." The captain studied the German's face for a moment, then turned to his radio operator. "Get me battalion headquarters immediately." While they waited for the radio connection to be established, Aldridge continued questioning Friedrich. "What specific routes will the attack follow?" Friedrich approached the map spread on the table, moving slowly to avoid alarming the Americans. "May I?" At Aldridge's nod, he pointed to several roads leading into the village. "Main thrust here along the Saint-Maximin road. Secondary attacks from these 2 approaches. Artillery preparation beginning at 0345. They will use smoke to cover the advance of the armor." The radio operator called over, "Captain, I have Colonel Weatherford on the line." Aldridge moved to the radio, briefly explaining the situation and the new intelligence. After a short conversation, he returned to the group. "Colonel Weatherford is alerting all companies and requesting immediate artillery support. He's also expediting the air support request for First Light." He turned to Friedrich. "If this intelligence proves accurate, you've done us a significant service. If not," Friedrich met his gaze steadily. "It is accurate, Captain. I gain nothing by lying." Captain Aldridge nodded to Staff Sergeant Miller. "Keep him here under guard. If his information checks out, we'll ensure he's treated accordingly." The next hour was a flurry of activity as Baker Company reorganized its defenses based on the new intelligence. Anti-tank teams were repositioned to cover the expected avenues of approach. Foxholes were deepened, and additional ammunition was distributed. The handful of bazooka teams in the company were given priority positions covering the roads where the German armor was expected. Daniel found himself assigned to one such position alongside Sergeant Morelli, who had experience as a bazooka operator in the Italian campaign. "Your German friend better be telling the truth," Morelli commented, as they prepared their position in the second story of a stone house overlooking the main road. "Otherwise, we're repositioning our entire defense for nothing." "I believe him," Daniel replied, helping to move furniture to create a clear firing position through the window. "He took an enormous risk coming back here. He could have just disappeared after escaping." Morelli grunted non-committally. "Maybe. Or maybe he's the best actor in the German army. Guess we'll find out in about 90 minutes. As the hours crept toward 0400, tension mounted throughout the American positions. If Friedrich's intelligence was accurate, Baker Company would soon be facing an overwhelming force. Their only advantages would be preparation and the element of surprise. The Germans would not be expecting such a prepared defense in what they likely believed was a recently captured and lightly held village. At the company command post, Friedrich remained under guard, but was treated with increasing respect as his detailed knowledge of German unit dispositions and attack methodology convinced the American officers of his sincerity. Captain Aldridge had requested and received authorization to deploy all company assets in anticipation of the attack. Additionally, the battalion's heavy weapons company had dispatched several extra machine gun teams and a mortar section to reinforce Baker Company's positions. Artillery batteries 5 miles to the south had been alerted and given preliminary firing coordinates based on Friedrich's information. At 0330, the first confirmation came. American listening posts reported the distinct sounds of multiple tracked vehicles approaching from the northeast. Minutes later, forward observers confirmed the presence of German armor moving into assembly positions approximately 2 miles from the village. Captain Aldridge summoned Daniel to the command post. "Harrington, I want you to stay with our German friend here. You've established some rapport with him, and he might have additional insights as the situation develops." Daniel acknowledged the order and took up position near Friedrich, who sat on a wooden chair, his expression tense but resolved. "They're coming, just as you said," Daniel told him. Friedrich nodded. "Your officers have prepared well, but it will still be difficult. The Panthers are superior to your Sherman tanks, and you have no armor here." "We have other advantages," Daniel replied. "Artillery support, prepared positions, and now, thanks to you, we won't be surprised." Friedrich looked at him curiously. "Why did you give me water earlier today when I was captured?" The question caught Daniel off guard. It seemed such a minor action amid the momentous events unfolding around them. "You looked like you needed it. Doesn't matter what uniform you're wearing in this heat." Simple kindness, Friedrich mused, remarkable in war. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells. The German preparation had begun, right on schedule. "Get down!" Captain Aldridge shouted as the first shells impacted near the village perimeter. Daniel instinctively dove for cover, pulling Friedrich down with him as plaster and dust showered from the ceiling. For the next 15 minutes, German artillery pounded the American positions. The stone buildings of the village provided good protection, but the noise was deafening, a constant thunder of explosions mixed with the crash of collapsing masonry. Between artillery barrages, Daniel could hear the rumble of tank engines growing steadily louder. The German armor was advancing behind the artillery preparation, exactly as Friedrich had warned. In the command post, officers shouted into field telephones and radios, coordinating the defense as reports flowed in from observation posts. Friedrich watched this activity with a strange mixture of professional interest and personal concern. "Your artillery should fire now," he suggested during a brief lull. "The tanks will be bunched together in the approach." Captain Aldridge, overhearing this, nodded to his artillery liaison. "Tell Battery Charlie to commence firing. Fire mission, coordinates as previously arranged, full battery 5 rounds. Minutes later, the distinctive sound of American 105mm artillery shells screamed overhead in the opposite direction, heading toward the advancing German forces. The pre-registered coordinates, based on Friedrich's intelligence, allowed for accurate fire even in the darkness. Through field glasses, forward observers reported direct hits among the advancing German armored vehicles. 2 Panthers were confirmed destroyed, with several half-tracks also damaged. The German advance paused briefly to navigate around the knocked-out vehicles, providing the Americans precious additional minutes to prepare. At 04:15, the first German tanks appeared at the edge of the village, their massive forms silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Simultaneously, infantry half-tracks disgorged German soldiers who began to advance cautiously toward the American positions. The battle was joined in earnest as American machine guns opened fire on the German infantry while bazooka teams held their fire, waiting for the armored vehicles to move within effective range. In the company command post, the sounds of intense combat filled the air. Captain Aldridge directed the defense calmly, shifting resources to meet the German thrusts as they developed. Friedrich remained seated in the corner, his expression unreadable as he listened to reports of his former comrades being engaged by American forces. Daniel, maintaining his position near Friedrich per his orders, found himself wondering about the complex emotions the German must be experiencing. To have potentially saved American lives at the cost of his countrymen's was no small decision. "Do you regret warning us?" Daniel asked quietly during a moment when the officers were focused on the field telephone. Friedrich considered the question before answering, No. This attack, it accomplishes nothing. More deaths for no purpose. The war is lost for Germany, though many will not admit this. If my warning saves lives on both sides by preventing a successful surprise attack, then I have done right." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent report from the northern perimeter. A group of German tanks had broken through the initial defensive line and was approaching the village center. The company's bazookas had accounted for 3 Panthers, but the remaining armor was pushing forward aggressively. "All available anti-tank teams to sectors 3 and 4, Captain Aldridge ordered. Morelli's team to the church tower for elevated firing position. The situation was becoming critical. Despite the advance warning and prepared positions, the sheer weight of the German assault was beginning to tell. American casualties were mounting, with reports of several positions being overrun. Captain Aldridge turned to his executive officer. "We may need to consider a fighting withdrawal to the secondary positions at the southern edge of the village." It was at this precise moment that the command post took a direct hit from a German tank shell. The explosion ripped through the room, sending furniture, equipment, and men flying in all directions. Daniel felt himself lifted and thrown against a wall, his ears ringing from the concussive force. When his senses returned moments later, he found himself partially buried under debris. Dust filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. He could hear groaning and cries for medics. Pushing aside the broken timber lying across his legs, Daniel struggled to his feet. The command post was in ruins. Several officers and enlisted men lay motionless on the floor. Captain Aldridge was being attended to by a medic, a bloody gash visible across his forehead. The radio equipment had been destroyed, severing communication with battalion headquarters and the artillery support. Daniel looked around frantically for Friedrich, finally spotting him beneath an overturned table. The German appeared to be unconscious, but alive. As Daniel moved toward him, a secondary explosion rocked the building, likely a fire reaching stored ammunition. "We need to evacuate," the executive officer shouted, having assumed command with Captain Aldridge incapacitated. "This position is compromised. Fall back to the church. We'll establish a new command post there." In the chaos of the moment, with the sounds of German tanks now alarmingly close, the wounded were given priority for evacuation. Daniel found himself faced with a decision: follow orders and fall back, or attempt to help the unconscious German who had risked everything to warn them. The weight of the simple act of shared water earlier that day somehow tipped the balance. Daniel could not leave Friedrich behind. Struggling through the debris, he reached the German's side and checked for serious injuries. Finding none immediately apparent, he hoisted Friedrich's unconscious form across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. "Harrington, what are you doing?" the executive officer called as Daniel staggered toward the exit with his burden. "He warned us, sir. Saved many of our lives. I can't leave him here." The officer hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Get him to the aid station at the church, then report back for reassignment. Move quickly. The Germans are less than 200 yards from this position." Daniel emerged from the ruined command post into a scene of intense combat. Tracer fire crisscrossed the pre-dawn darkness. The distinctive shape of a Panther tank was visible at the end of the street, its main gun traversing toward a concealed American position. Infantry on both sides exchanged fire from windows, doorways, and improvised barricades. Keeping close to the buildings for cover, Daniel made his way toward the church, the unconscious weight of Friedrich making each step a struggle. Twice he had to take cover as German machine gun fire swept the street. Once, an American soldier from another platoon gave him a questioning look at the German uniform of his burden, but offered covering fire nonetheless. The village church had been converted into an aid station, its thick stone walls providing protection for the wounded. As Daniel approached the entrance, he could see medics working by lamplight on injured soldiers laid out in the nave. "Got another one," Daniel called as he entered, carefully lowering Friedrich onto an empty space on the floor. "German prisoner. Intelligence asset. Important to keep him alive." The harried medical officer barely glanced up from the American soldier he was treating. "German or American, they all bleed the same. We'll get to him when we can." Daniel hesitated, reluctant to leave Friedrich, but aware of his duty to return to the fighting. The battle for the village was reaching its climax, with the outcome still uncertain. Every able body was needed on the line. "I'll be back," he told the unconscious German, though he had no way of knowing if he could keep that promise. Exiting the church, Daniel oriented himself toward the sounds of the heaviest fighting. Baker Company was making a determined stand at the village square, where several anti-tank teams had established interlocking fields of fire. As he approached, he saw Sergeant Morelli's bazooka team in action, firing from a second-story window at a German half-track attempting to deploy infantry. The rocket struck the half-track squarely, turning it into a fireball that illuminated the surrounding buildings with an orange glow. German soldiers scrambled from the burning vehicle, some with their uniforms alight. Daniel made his way to Morelli's position, dodging from cover to cover. "Sergeant, command post was hit, reporting for reassignment." Morelli glanced at him while his assistant reloaded the bazooka. "We're setting up a defensive perimeter around the square. Lieutenant Parker has taken command with Captain Aldridge wounded. Get to the eastern corner. Second squad needs ammunition runners." Daniel nodded and moved off through the battle-scarred streets. The fighting had taken on a desperate quality, with both sides fully committed. The pre-dawn light was beginning to illuminate the battlefield, revealing the extent of destruction. Several buildings were ablaze, casting a hellish glow over the combatants. The charred hulks of destroyed vehicles, both German and American, littered the approaches to the village center. As Daniel reached Second Squad's position, a tremendous explosion rocked the northern edge of the village. Looking in that direction, he saw a column of flame reaching skyward. "Ammunition truck," someone shouted. "Direct hit on one of their half-tracks carrying ammunition." The explosion seemed to mark a turning point in the battle. The German advance, already slowed by the unexpected resistance, began to falter. Reports reached the American positions that air support was inbound. P-47 Thunderbolts, responding to the urgent requests sent before the command post was destroyed. Lieutenant Parker, now commanding what remained of Baker Company, organized a counterattack to clear the remaining German infantry from the eastern section of the village. Daniel found himself advancing with a depleted rifle squad, moving cautiously from building to building as they searched for enemy holdouts. The first rays of dawn revealed the toll of the night's fighting. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in the terrible, contorted poses of violent death, others appearing almost peaceful. Wounded men from both sides called for aid in multiple languages. The village that had been a picturesque French settlement the previous day was now a shattered landscape of broken stone and splintered wood. By 6:30 in the morning, it was clear that the German attack had been repulsed. Surviving enemy forces were withdrawing to the north, harassed by American aircraft that had arrived with the daylight. The 11th Panzer Division's battle group had suffered heavy casualties. Later reports would confirm the destruction of 17 tanks and 28 other vehicles, with over 100 German soldiers killed and twice that number captured. Baker Company had paid a steep price as well. Of the original 120 men who had captured the village the previous day, 37 were dead or seriously wounded. Captain Aldridge would survive his injuries, but would be evacuated to a field hospital for treatment. As the intensity of combat diminished, Daniel remembered Friedrich and made his way back to the church aid station. The scene inside was one of controlled chaos, with medics working tirelessly to stabilize the wounded for evacuation. It took several minutes of searching before Daniel located Friedrich, who had been moved to a corner of the nave alongside other German prisoners receiving medical attention. To Daniel's relief, Friedrich was conscious, though pale and disoriented. A bandage had been applied to a wound on his temple. "You're alive," Daniel said, kneeling beside him. Friedrich's eyes focused on Daniel's face, recognition dawning slowly. "Daniel Harrington, you brought me here. Couldn't leave you behind. Not after what you did." Friedrich managed a weak smile. "The attack, it failed. Completely. Your warning made all the difference. We were ready for them." A complex mix of emotions crossed Friedrich's face: relief, sadness, perhaps a touch of guilt. Good. No more senseless death than necessary. A medical corpsman approached them. "We're evacuating the wounded soon. All prisoners will be transported to the field hospital, then to a proper POW facility." Daniel nodded, then turned back to Friedrich. "You'll be treated well. The officers know what you did for us." Friedrich's expression became more serious. "War makes strange debts between men. You gave water to an enemy. I gave warning to save your lives. Perhaps now we are even." Daniel considered this. "I think you've paid back my small kindness many times over." "Not kindness against kindness," Friedrich replied. "Life against life. Such is the accounting of war." Lieutenant Parker appeared at the church entrance, calling for all able-bodied men to help secure the perimeter against possible counterattack. Daniel rose to respond to the summons. "I have to go," he told Friedrich, "but I'll try to check on you before you're evacuated." Friedrich reached out and grasped Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. "Remember this day, Daniel Harrington. Remember that even in war, humanity can survive. That a German and an American chose to see each other as men first, soldiers second." Daniel nodded, struck by the profound truth of the statement. "I'll remember." As Daniel turned to leave, Friedrich called after him. "The debt between us may not yet be fully paid. War has many days still ahead." Those words would prove more prophetic than either man could have imagined at that moment. The strange bond formed between an American private and a German corporal, through the simple sharing of water and the subsequent warning that saved many lives, would be tested again, and in circumstances that would once more place one man's life in the other's hands. December 17, 1944. 4 months had passed since that fateful encounter in the small French village. The war had progressed with the inexorable momentum of a great machine, grinding forward across Europe. The Allied forces had pushed steadily eastward, liberating France and pressing toward the German border. But now, in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, that advance had not only been halted but violently reversed. Private First Class Daniel Harrington, recently promoted after the actions at Montagne-sur-Colline, huddled in a shallow foxhole as artillery shells exploded among the trees around him. Frozen chunks of earth and splintered wood rained down, adding to the misery of the biting cold. The 106th Infantry Division, to which Daniel and other veterans from his original unit had been transferred as replacements, was directly in the path of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest. Intelligence had completely failed to anticipate the scale and ferocity of the German attack. Launched in the pre-dawn hours with overwhelming force, the offensive had shattered the thinly held American lines. Now, scattered groups of American soldiers were fighting desperate holding actions as they fell back toward more defensible positions. Daniel's platoon had been separated from their company during the chaotic retreat. Lieutenant Grayson, a replacement officer with limited combat experience, was struggling to maintain cohesion among his 30 remaining men as they withdrew through the dense forest. Their radio had been damaged, leaving them without communication to higher headquarters or adjacent units. "Hold position here," Lieutenant Grayson ordered as they reached a small ridgeline offering some natural protection. "Establish a perimeter. We'll wait for reinforcements or further orders." Staff Sergeant Miller, who had been with Daniel since France and was now the platoon sergeant, exchanged skeptical glances with the more experienced men. The sounds of combat were growing louder from the east, suggesting that German forces were advancing rapidly in their direction. "Sir," Miller addressed the lieutenant, "with respect, we are likely to be overrun if we remain stationary. The Germans have armor and overwhelming numbers. We should continue moving west toward St. Vith, where the main defensive line is being established." Lieutenant Grayson hesitated, the weight of command evident in his expression. "Our orders were to hold this sector, Sergeant." "Those orders were issued before the entire front collapsed, sir. The strategic situation has changed." Their discussion was interrupted by Private Jenkins, who had been serving as a lookout. "Movement to the northeast 400 yards and closing, multiple figures moving through the trees." The men took up defensive positions along the ridgeline, weapons trained on the approaching threat. Through the swirling snow, Daniel could make out the forms of soldiers in winter camouflage, at least a company-sized element of German infantry advancing in loose formation. "Hold fire until they're within 200 yards, Lieutenant Grayson instructed. "Make every shot count." Daniel settled behind a fallen log, sighting his M1 Garand rifle on the approaching figures. The temperature had dropped below freezing. causing his breath to form visible clouds in the air. His fingers were numb despite the gloves he wore, making it difficult to maintain a proper grip on his weapon. As the German infantry drew closer, details became more distinct. They were Wehrmacht regulars, not SS troops, their helmets covered with white cloth for winter camouflage. They moved with the confidence of experienced soldiers who believed they had the initiative. At 200 yards, Lieutenant Grayson gave the order to fire. The ridgeline erupted with the sharp cracks of American rifles and the distinctive chattering of Browning automatic rifles. The first volley caught the Germans by surprise, dropping several soldiers and sending others diving for cover among the trees and snowdrifts. The Germans quickly recovered from their initial shock and returned fire. The exchange intensified as more German troops arrived, their superior numbers becoming evident. Machine gun fire raked the American positions, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Sergeant Miller shouted above the din of combat. "Watson, take your fire team and cover that approach." The platoon fought doggedly, but the situation was deteriorating by the minute. The German force continued to grow as additional units arrived, while the Americans had no reinforcements to call upon. Lieutenant Grayson, now recognizing the gravity of their predicament, moved along the line to confer with Sergeant Miller. "We can't hold this position," he admitted. "Organize a fighting withdrawal. Teams of 2 leapfrog backward while maintaining covering fire." As the platoon began its withdrawal, the distinctive rumble of tank engines became audible through the forest to their east. The sound sent a chill through the American defenders that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Armor!" someone shouted. "German tanks approaching!" Through gaps in the trees, Daniel caught glimpses of at least 3 Panzer tanks advancing to support the German infantry. The appearance of armor shifted the already uneven engagement into an entirely hopeless one for the Americans. "Move! Everyone move now," Lieutenant Grayson ordered, abandoning the previous withdrawal plan in favor of immediate retreat. The platoon broke contact and moved westward as quickly as the snow-covered terrain would allow. The Germans pursued, their advance accelerated by the armored support. Sporadic fire continued as the Americans fled through the forest, using the trees and undulating ground for cover. Daniel found himself running alongside Private Cooper, a replacement who had joined the unit only 2 weeks earlier. The young soldier was struggling through the deep snow, his breathing labored and panicked. "Pace yourself," Daniel advised him. "We've got a long way to go." As they crested a small rise, Cooper suddenly jerked backward, a cry of pain escaping his lips. Daniel turned to see the private clutching his leg, bright red blood staining the snow beneath him. "I'm hit," Cooper gasped. "Go on without me." Daniel shook his head, slinging his rifle and moving to support the wounded man. "Not leaving you behind. Put your arm over my shoulder." With Cooper leaning heavily against him, Daniel resumed their retreat at a much slower pace. The main body of the platoon had continued forward, leaving them increasingly isolated. The sounds of German voices grew louder behind them as their pursuers closed the distance. "You should go," Cooper insisted, his face pale from blood loss and pain. "I'll just slow you down until we're both captured." "Keep moving," Daniel replied grimly, "one step at a time." They had covered perhaps another 100 yards when disaster struck. As they navigated a steep slope, Cooper's wounded leg gave way, sending both men tumbling down the incline. They came to rest at the bottom, partially buried in snow. Cooper had lost consciousness during the fall, either from pain or the cold. Daniel struggled to his feet, trying to get his bearings. The voices of German soldiers were alarmingly close now. Looking up the slope, he could see figures moving along the ridge they had just descended. There was no possibility of carrying Cooper any further without being spotted. With no other options, Daniel quickly scraped snow into a shallow depression at the base of a large pine tree, creating a rudimentary shelter. He dragged Cooper's unconscious form into this makeshift hideout and covered him with fallen branches and snow, hoping it might conceal the wounded man from casual observation. Daniel had just completed this hasty concealment when German voices became audible less than 50 yards away. With Cooper hidden as best he could manage, Daniel made the difficult decision to continue alone, hoping to draw pursuit away from his wounded comrade. He had moved perhaps 20 yards when a voice called out in German, followed by the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied. Daniel froze, then slowly raised his hands. He turned to find himself facing 4 German soldiers, their weapons trained steadily on him. One of the Germans, a sergeant by his insignia, addressed him in broken English. "American, you surrender now." Daniel considered his options, which were effectively none. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of alternatives. Slowly, he unslung his rifle and placed it on the ground. "I surrender," he said, his voice flat with resignation. The German sergeant nodded with satisfaction, then issued orders to his men. 2 soldiers approached Daniel cautiously, one covering him, while the other searched him for additional weapons and removed his ammunition and equipment. "Others with you?" the sergeant asked. Daniel shook his head, keeping his expression neutral. "I got separated from my unit." The German seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue immediately. Instead, he directed his men to secure their prisoner for transport to the rear areas. Daniel's hands were bound in front of him with cord, and he was instructed to march eastward under guard. As they moved off, Daniel cast a final glance back toward the location where he had hidden Cooper, praying that the wounded man would remain undiscovered, long enough for other American forces to find him. It seemed a faint hope at best. The journey to the German rear areas was an arduous one. Daniel and several other American prisoners collected along the way were marched eastward through the snow-covered forest for hours. The German guards were stern, but not abusive, driven by the same cold and exhaustion that afflicted their captives. By nightfall, they reached a collection point for prisoners, a farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary processing center. Dozens of captured Americans stood or sat in the barnyard, surrounded by German guards. The processing was efficient, but impersonal. Name, rank, and serial number were recorded, and personal items of potential intelligence value were confiscated. After processing, Daniel was directed to join a group of prisoners in the barn. The structure provided shelter from the snow, but little protection from the cold. The prisoners huddled together for warmth, sharing what remained of their rations and trading information about the German offensive. They hit the entire line, a sergeant from the 28th Division told the assembled men, broke through in multiple locations. Word is they're driving for the Meuse River, maybe even Antwerp beyond that. "How did they assemble so much force without us knowing?" someone asked. "Intelligence failure," the sergeant replied grimly. "They staged in the forest, moved only at night, complete surprise." The conversation continued in hushed tones as the prisoners speculated about the battle still raging to their west. Daniel participated minimally, his mind occupied with thoughts of his captured comrades and the wounded Cooper, whom he had been forced to abandon. Around midnight, the barn door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and several German officers. The prisoners fell silent as the officers moved among them, occasionally stopping to question individuals with the assistance of a translator. One of the officers, a major by his insignia, approached Daniel's group. The translator, a corporal, addressed them in accented but fluent English. "The major wishes to know if any of you have special skills, mechanics, medical training, or other technical abilities. Those with useful skills may be assigned to work details with better conditions." Most of the prisoners remained silent, offering only their name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. The major seemed unsurprised by this response and was preparing to move on when his gaze fell on Daniel. For a moment, the officer studied Daniel's face with unusual intensity. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the major addressed him directly in perfect English. "Private First Class Daniel Harrington, 157th Infantry Regiment, originally from Nebraska, is that correct?" Daniel's shock at hearing his name and details must have been evident on his face. "How could you possibly know that?" The German major removed his officer's cap, revealing features that Daniel had not expected to see again. The face of Gefreiter Friedrich Weber, the prisoner to whom he had offered water in that French village months earlier. "Friedrich," Daniel whispered in disbelief. A flicker of a smile crossed the German's face. "No longer Gefreiter Weber. Now Major Friedrich Weber, 2nd Battalion, 12th Panzer Regiment. The fortunes of war change quickly, do they not?" Daniel was speechless. The transformation from the captured enlisted soldier he had encountered in France to this confident officer was astonishing. The other prisoners looked on in confusion at the unexpected exchange. Friedrich turned to the translator and issued instructions in German. The corporal nodded and addressed the assembled prisoners. "The major will return shortly. Remain where you are." With that, Friedrich exited the barn, leaving Daniel and his fellow prisoners to wonder at the strange encounter. The American sergeant who had been speaking earlier edged closer to Daniel. "You know that officer?" he asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Daniel nodded slowly. "From several months ago in France. He was a prisoner then, a corporal, not a major. He warned us about a German attack, saved many American lives." He hesitated before adding, "I can't understand how he's now a major in a panzer regiment." "Could be intelligence," the sergeant suggested. "German counterintelligence using your previous connection." Before Daniel could respond, the barn door opened again and Friedrich returned. This time he was alone. He gestured to the guards. "Private Harrington will come with me for questioning." The guards moved to escort Daniel from the barn. His fellow prisoners watched with expressions ranging from concern to outright suspicion as he was led outside into the snowy night. Friedrich led the way toward the farmhouse, neither speaking nor acknowledging Daniel until they were inside a small room that appeared to be serving as an officer's quarters. Once the door closed behind them, Friedrich turned to Daniel. "You must have many questions." "That would be an understatement," Daniel replied cautiously. "Last I saw you, you were a wounded prisoner being evacuated to an American field hospital." Friedrich nodded. "And so I was. I spent 6 weeks in American captivity before I was included in a prisoner exchange, one of the few that have occurred during this conflict. My actions in warning your unit about the attack had been documented by your officers. This documentation was discovered during my interrogation after the exchange. And instead of being punished as a traitor, how you were promoted?" Daniel asked incredulously. A complex expression crossed Friedrich's face. "The situation was complicated. The intelligence officers who debriefed me concluded that I had acted under extreme duress and possibly concussion from the initial fighting. Rather than court-martial me, they saw an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "My knowledge of American procedures, combined with my limited English skills, made me valuable for intelligence work. My education before the war, which included 2 years at university studying engineering, qualified me for officer training. The acute shortage of experienced officers led to my rapid advancement." Daniel studied the German's face, searching for signs of the young prisoner he had encountered in France. "And now you're leading tanks in an offensive that's killing thousands of Americans. Was everything you told me in that village a lie?" Friedrich's expression hardened. "I told you no lies, Daniel Harrington. I warned your unit because I believed then, as I believe now, that the war is ultimately lost for Germany. But I am still a German. I still have family in Dresden, family who would suffer greatly if my loyalty were questioned. When returned to German control, I had no choice but to serve as directed." "There's always a choice," Daniel countered. "Is there?" Friedrich asked quietly. "Would you choose your principles over the safety of your family, over the lives of your comrades who depend on you?" He shook his head. "War forces impossible choices upon all of us." A silence fell between them, filled with the unspoken complexities of their respective situations. Finally, Friedrich spoke again, his voice lower and more urgent. "I did not bring you here for philosophical debate. Tomorrow morning, all prisoners are being transported eastward to permanent camps in Germany. The journey will be difficult, with limited food and shelter. Many will not survive the winter march." Daniel absorbed this information grimly. Stories of the harsh conditions faced by prisoners of war, especially during winter, were well known among American troops. "Why are you telling me this?" Friedrich stepped closer. "Because tonight you will not be among them. You will escape." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "Escape? How? And why would you help me?" "As to how, I have arranged for you to be temporarily assigned to a work detail unloading supplies from trucks at the edge of the camp. The guards there have been told to expect a prisoner with special mechanical knowledge to help repair a damaged vehicle. During this assignment, there will be a moment when supervision is minimal. You will find a path leading south through the forest. Take it. 5 kilometers in that direction you will encounter American lines, elements of the 2nd Armored Division that have moved up to contain our advance. Friedrich reached into his pocket and withdrew a compass which he pressed into Daniel's hand. Use this to maintain your direction. The forest is disorienting, especially at night. Daniel closed his fingers around the compass, still struggling to comprehend what was happening. And as to why, Friedrich's expression softened slightly. In France, you asked me why I warned your unit about the attack. I told you then that I had no love for this war. That remains true, but there is a more personal reason now. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. You shared your water with an enemy soldier. Later you carried me to safety when your command post was destroyed. Such debts must be repaid. A life for a life, Daniel said, echoing Friedrich's words from their conversation in the church aid station months earlier. Precisely. Friedrich checked his watch. The work detail begins in 20 minutes. A guard will come for you shortly. Do not attempt to communicate with other prisoners before then. Daniel nodded his understanding but raised another concern. What about you? If I escape, won't you be held responsible? I have considered that risk. The confusion of the offensive provides certain opportunities for administrative oversight. The records will show that you were transferred to another collection point before the escape was discovered. By then, the trail will be cold. The calculated precision of this plan suggested that Friedrich had given it considerable thought. Daniel found himself wondering how many other impossible choices the German officer had faced since their last meeting. There is one more thing, Friedrich said, reaching into his pocket again. This time he withdrew a folded piece of paper. If you reach American lines safely, I would ask that you deliver this letter. It contains information for your intelligence services, details about the German offensive, our strength and vulnerabilities. Daniel took the folded paper with stunned disbelief. You're betraying your own side? Why? Friedrich's expression was unreadable. As I told you in France, this offensive, like so many German operations at this stage of the war, will accomplish nothing except more death. Perhaps this information will help bring the conflict to a swifter conclusion. He paused, then added more quietly, and perhaps when the final accounting is made, it will be remembered that not all Germans were blind followers. Before Daniel could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. Friedrich straightened, his demeanor instantly transforming back into that of the stern German officer. Enter, he called in German. A guard appeared, saluting sharply. Friedrich issued orders in rapid German, then turned back to Daniel with an impersonal nod. The prisoner will be taken to the work detail now. As Daniel was led away, Friedrich called after him in English. Remember, Private Harrington, directions have been given. Follow them precisely. The guard escorted Daniel across the farmyard toward the edge of the encampment where several trucks were parked. German soldiers were unloading supplies, ammunition, rations, and fuel containers. As promised, Daniel was instructed to assist a mechanic working on one of the vehicles, a task for which he had no particular qualification. The German mechanic seemed uninterested in Daniel's presence, focusing entirely on the engine he was attempting to repair. For nearly an hour, Daniel handed tools to the mechanic and followed simple instructions to hold parts in place. Throughout this time, he was acutely aware of the guard assigned to watch him, noting how the man's attention occasionally wandered to conversations with passing soldiers. Eventually, the predicted opportunity arrived. The guard was called aside by an officer, stepping just far enough away that Daniel found himself momentarily unwatched. The mechanic had crawled under the truck to examine something beneath the chassis. Daniel's heart pounded as he assessed his situation. The forest's edge was less than 30 yards away, shrouded in darkness. Between his position and the trees were stacked crates and fuel containers that would provide concealment for at least part of the distance. Taking a deep breath, Daniel set down the wrench he had been holding and slipped behind the truck. Moving as quietly as possible, he made his way between the supply crates, using them as cover. Each step seemed agonizingly slow, each small sound magnified by his fear of discovery. Reaching the final crate before open ground, Daniel paused, listening for any alarm. Hearing none, he took a final look back at the camp, then sprinted for the tree line. The few seconds of exposure felt like an eternity, but finally, the darkness of the forest enveloped him. Once among the trees, Daniel continued running for several minutes, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the camp before stopping to get his bearings. He withdrew the compass Friedrich had given him, orienting himself to move south as instructed. The forest at night was a challenging environment for navigation. Snow-covered ground concealed obstacles, while the dense trees blocked what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Daniel moved cautiously but steadily, checking the compass frequently to maintain his course. Hours passed as he trekked through the winter forest. The temperature continued to drop, and exhaustion began to take its toll. Several times, distant sounds caused him to freeze in place, fearing German patrols, but each time the forest returned to silence. By what he estimated to be early morning, Daniel had been walking for at least 6 hours. Friedrich had said the American lines were 5 kilometers away, a distance he should have covered by now. Doubt began to creep into his mind. Had he maintained the correct direction? Had Friedrich sent him into a trap? Or had the American positions moved since Friedrich had last received intelligence? These questions cycled through Daniel's mind as fatigue and cold increasingly clouded his judgment. His pace had slowed considerably, each step becoming a deliberate act of will. He knew that to stop moving in such temperatures would be potentially fatal, yet his body screamed for rest. It was in this state of near exhaustion that Daniel stumbled into a small clearing and found himself suddenly illuminated by a powerful flashlight. "Halt! Identify yourself," came a voice in English, an American voice. Relief flooded through Daniel as he raised his hands. Private First Class Daniel Harrington, 106th Infantry Division. Figures emerged from concealed positions around the clearing. American soldiers in winter combat gear, weapons trained cautiously on him until his identity could be verified. A sergeant approached, his Thompson submachine gun held ready. "What's the password, soldier?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know it, Sergeant. I've been a prisoner since yesterday. Escaped from a German collection point northeast of here." The sergeant studied him skeptically. "We'll need to verify that. Anyone can put on an American uniform." "Understood," Daniel replied, too exhausted to take offense at the suspicion. "I have information about German positions and strength, important intelligence." He reached slowly into his pocket, retrieving the folded paper Friedrich had given him. The sergeant accepted the document cautiously, then directed 2 of his men to escort Daniel to their command post. "Lieutenant Grant will want to debrief you personally." As they led him through their defensive positions, Daniel observed that he had indeed reached elements of the 2nd Armored Division, just as Friedrich had indicated. Their position was part of a hastily established line attempting to contain the German breakthrough. At the command post, a reinforced basement in a partially destroyed farmhouse, Daniel was given hot coffee and a blanket while the duty officer examined his identification and the document he had carried from the German camp. Lieutenant Grant, a tired-looking officer with 3 days' worth of stubble, studied the papers with increasing interest. "Where did you get this intelligence, Private?" Daniel hesitated, unsure how to explain the extraordinary circumstances of his escape. "A German officer, sir, one who believes the offensive will ultimately fail and wants to bring the war to a quicker end." The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "A German officer just handed you detailed information about their armor strengths, fuel reserves, and planned routes of advance?" "It's complicated, sir. This particular officer and we have a history from earlier in the campaign in France." Lieutenant Grant looked skeptical, but returned his attention to the document. "Well, complicated or not, this information aligns with what our reconnaissance has observed. If accurate, it's extremely valuable." He looked up at Daniel again. "You realize this will need to be verified, and you'll face extensive questioning from intelligence officers." "Yes, sir, I understand." The lieutenant nodded, then issued instructions to his radio operator to contact division headquarters. Turning back to Daniel, his expression softened slightly. "In the meantime, get some food and rest. You look dead on your feet." Daniel was escorted to an area where other soldiers were sleeping in shifts. Finding an empty cot, he collapsed onto it, the events of the past 24 hours washing over him in waves of exhaustion. As sleep claimed him, his final thoughts were of Friedrich Weber, the enemy soldier who had now saved his life not once but twice, all because of a simple canteen of water shared months earlier. In the days that followed, Daniel was indeed extensively debriefed by intelligence officers. The information Friedrich had provided proved accurate and valuable, contributing to the American efforts to contain and eventually repel the German offensive. What became known as the Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the ultimate outcome, Allied victory, was never truly in doubt, just as Friedrich had believed. Daniel never learned what became of Friedrich Weber after that night. The chaos of the war's final months, as the Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, obscured the fates of countless individuals on both sides. Daniel would often wonder whether Friedrich survived the conflict, whether he managed to protect his family in Dresden despite his clandestine assistance to the Americans, whether the complexity of his choices during the war haunted him as they sometimes haunted Daniel. What remained certain, however, was the profound lesson Daniel had learned through their unlikely connection, that even in the dehumanizing machinery of total war, individual acts of compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality and uniform. A shared canteen of water on a hot day in France had created a debt that saved lives on both sides of the conflict, a reminder that beneath the categories of ally and enemy existed simply human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control. After the war, Daniel would return to his family farm in Nebraska, carrying with him the compass Friedrich had given him, a tangible reminder of the night his life was saved by a man who, by all conventional definitions, should have been his enemy. On difficult days, when memories of the war surfaced unexpectedly, Daniel would hold that compass, using it as his own moral guide to remember that kindness, even toward those deemed other, was never wasted. In 1965, a package arrived at Daniel's farm with a Berlin postmark. Inside was a letter and a faded photograph of two men, Friedrich Weber and his young son, standing beside a university building. The letter was brief, but profound. A good act ripples outward through time in ways we cannot predict. My son studies agriculture at university. Perhaps one day he will visit American farms to learn their methods. If so, I have told him to look for a farmer in Nebraska who once shared his water with an enemy, and in doing so changed the course of many lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.